During his nearly 6 decades of practicing law, Alan Dershowitz has defended a fair share of high-profile, controversial clients. Everything from a group of American neo-Nazis who wanted to stage a march to WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange. Often described as a civil libertarian, his early career was marked with cases in which championed social issues and defended free speech. His most recent clients include a who's who of headline makers, including O.J. Simpson and Jeffrey Epstein. But a couple of years after harshly criticizing Donald Trump, Dershowitz is now part of a legal team defending the president against impeachment. He joins me now to talk about his defense of the president on the Senate floor. Good to have you on the program, sir. Based on the argument that you made on the Senate floor, the interpretation that many of us have is, well, the president can pressure Ukraine to investigate his political rival by withholding aid, because while it might be an abuse of power, it's still in the public interest, and he's trying to get reelected. Is that it?
No, that's not it. What I'm saying is what the president did was not necessarily right. Being in the public interest doesn't excuse a crime, but it wasn't a crime, and it wasn't an impeachable offense. It was a good reason to vote against President Trump. I voted against him in the last election, voting for Hillary Clinton. But there's an enormous difference between what's right and what's good on the one hand and what's impeachable or criminal on the other hand. And the argument I made is that whatever you may think of it, and many of the senators think what he did was wrong and even subject to condemnation, but it did not rise to the level of an impeachable offense. That's my argument.
Okay. Well, last Monday you told the Senate that you believe that abuse of power should not be an impeachable offense in the first place, right, under the Constitution. And then on Wednesday, let's have a listen to the closing bit of your argument. Let's have a listen for the sake of our viewers.
It would be a much harder case if a hypothetical president of the United States said to a hypothetical leader of a foreign country, unless you build a hotel with my name on it, and unless you give me $1 million kickback, I will withhold the funds. That's an easy case. That's purely corrupt and in the purely private interest. But a complex middle case is, I want to be elected. I think I'm a great president. I think I'm the greatest president there ever was. And if I'm not elected, the national interest will suffer greatly. That cannot be an impeachable offense. Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice.
And just to reiterate the words, if a president does something which he believes will help him get elected in the public interest, that cannot be the kind of quid pro quo that results in impeachment. You would understand why people would hear that and think that, well, what you're saying is that the founding fathers imagined something that was more suited to a Saddam Hussein than a democratically elected president.
No, not quite. I spent the whole hour talking to the Senate saying that if the president committed a crime or did anything unlawful or even criminal-like, akin to treason and bribery, that would be impeachable. And in the beginning of the answer to that very question, I said that if a president did anything unlawful or illegal, that would be impeachable. I'm talking about the president doing something completely legal, completely lawful, but he's motivated in part by a desire to be reelected, as every public official is always motivated in part by a desire to do something. That motive alone, the motive of wanting to be reelected because he believed it was in the public interest, that motive alone would not turn innocent conduct into criminal or impeachable conduct. I don't think anybody disagrees with that point. If a president does something out of mixed motives, does the right thing out of mixed motives, and part of the motive is, gee, I think I would like to get reelected. The example I gave is President Obama changing his mind over bombing Syria. Let's assume he had decided to bomb Syria after they used chemical weapons, but his pollsters came in and said, you know, if you bomb Syria, it may affect your reelection. And the president said, gee, I'm going to take that into consideration as well, and I'm going to make a decision not to bomb Syria. That alone would not be an impeachable offense. That was my only point, and it's been misunderstood, and it's been willfully misunderstood by Democrats who are trying to turn my argument into something that it was absolutely not.
In 1999, when it came to Bill Clinton, you said that there doesn't have to be a crime, that there doesn't have to be a technical crime for impeachment. How does this differ? Because you're saying, well, he didn't commit a crime.
Right. Well, I still don't think he has to have a technical crime. The example I gave is if some president took a bribe but took it in Paris instead of taking it in Washington, and therefore there's no jurisdiction to charge him under American law, or he did it more than 5 years ago, beyond the statute of limitations. It doesn't have to be a technical crime, but it has to be criminal-like behavior akin to treason or bribery. After all, the framers said treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. When you read other high crimes and misdemeanors in connection with treason and bribery, it certainly sounds like they intended it to be only criminal conduct. They rejected the term maladministration, and they rejected other terms like that. They didn't want broad, open-ended terms. They wanted narrow, specific, criminal-type terms. So I stand by that argument. Look, academics changed their mind. I nuanced my position over the 22 years that followed because I studied the issue much more closely when Trump was impeached, because the issue in the Trump case was, do you need a crime? That wasn't the issue in the Clinton case.
You said at the beginning that even though you felt this is not impeachable, you felt that he probably didn't do the right thing. Are you concerned that this president is going to use this as a green light to consider himself above the law, especially if he gets another term?
I am concerned about that, and I'm concerned that it's the Democrats who gave him the green light. I didn't make that argument. It's the Democrats who have caricatured that argument. I wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal the other day in which I said the great danger of misinterpreting my argument is that it will become a precedent, and people will think that the reason he was acquitted was that they accepted my argument that he can do anything he wants as long as it's in the public interest. That's not the argument I made. That's not the argument the senators heard. That's not the argument the senators are going to base their opinion on. But it's the Democrats who are making that argument, putting it out there, and they create the risk that it could be a precedent in the future that would diminish the presidency.
I ask you because this is someone that you said in 2016 is going to be a corrupt president and he's going to rule in a corrupt way. And your words exactly when comparing him to Clinton in 2016 were, this is someone who has engaged in more corruption than Clinton and who is more likely to continue that if elected president of the United States. That was a radio interview, right? So essentially he got away with not being impeached because technically it wasn't impeachable. But are you saying that you were defending a corrupt president on the Senate floor?
First of all, there's no such thing as technically not impeachable. He's either impeachable or he's not impeachable. He's not impeachable. The Constitution is all about technicalities. I was campaigning against President Trump when I made that statement, and that was a good reason for why I voted for Hillary Clinton. And it may be a good reason for how people vote in the 2020 election, but it's not a good reason for impeaching a president. Just because you would vote against somebody doesn't mean you vote to impeach him. Remember, the American system is different than the European parliamentary system. And the framers didn't want to turn us into a parliamentary democracy where the parliament, by a vote of no confidence, can simply end the tenure of a prime minister or a head of government. That's not what we wanted. We have elections every 4 years, one coming up in 8.5 months. And in that election, people can take into account what they believe he did, the pros, the cons, and make a decision. My argument is solely about whether it's impeachable, and it's not impeachable by my research and the history that I've looked into. And that's the argument I'm making. I stand by that argument quite proudly.
So let's take impeachment off the table, and he's being exonerated, and he's not going to be impeached. Let's go to your book in 2016, Electile Dysfunction, A Guide for Unaroused Voters. So you describe Trump as a destabilizing and unpredictable candidate. Trump is someone who openly embraces fringe conspiracy theories peddled by extremists. And this is most interesting to me. You said Trump will be prepared to violate existing international and domestic laws as well as widely accepted principles of human rights. Wasn't he doing that here by strong-arming Zelensky to investigate Biden publicly, or else he's going to withhold aid? Shouldn't you, 4 years on, have been the guy to say, I called it, I told you he's going to be doing this? Instead, you're getting paid by him and defending him on the Senate floor.
First of all, I'm not on his payroll. I'm not being paid for doing this. I haven't been paid. I'm doing this out of principle.
Oh, you've done it pro bono.
There's a big difference between what I say campaigning. There's a big difference between being a campaigner against him. That's a political issue. And I will take all of those issues into consideration in my vote in 2020, and being a lawyer for the Constitution. I'm there to defend the Constitution, to make sure it's not expanded beyond what it was intended by the framers. In my closing argument, I said, do not let your hatred for one man, no matter how strongly you feel about it, destroy our Constitution. So I'm there to defend the Constitution. My political views are my political views. And there are going to be many senators who vote for his acquittal who probably share views that are critical of him personally and politically. But it's very important not to confuse the criteria for impeachment with the criteria for who you vote for or who you vote against. In European countries, that sift is not as sharp because you have a parliamentary democracy, and if you disapprove of a prime minister's policies by a simple vote of non-confidence, career can be ended. But in America, we have a very different view. We have elections every 4 years, and the criteria for impeachment are very daunting and very difficult, and I don't want to see them watered down. I'd be making the same argument today if Hillary Clinton had been elected and she were being impeached for abuse of power. My argument is completely nonpartisan and principled, and I stand by it.
Okay. Do you stand by what you said in your book, that he is someone who is prepared to violate domestic and international laws and norms?
Well, when it comes to the election time, I'll consider all that. He certainly has been destabilizing. He sees that as a virtue. He's certainly been unpredictable. He sees that as a virtue. He took us out of the Iran deal. He sees that as a virtue. He has violated some of the norms of expected international cooperation with NATO. Those are all policy decisions that should be influential in people's decisions to vote for. And in the end, when the Democrats nominate somebody and I have to make an assessment who to vote for, I will take into consideration his policies. But for example, if Bernie Sanders were to be nominated by the Democrats, I would take into consideration his policies, many of which I disapprove of, and I'd strike a balance like all voters should do. But that shouldn't be confused with the criteria for impeachment.
You supported the Nixon impeachment. Tell me briefly how you feel this compares to the Nixon impeachment.
Well, there's no comparison. Nixon committed 5 separate indictable offenses. He obstructed justice. He paid hush money to witnesses who were about to testify against him. He destroyed evidence. He told his subordinates to lie to the FBI. And those are all impeachable offenses. I strongly supported his impeachment, which gives the lie to the notion I think a president can do anything in the national interest. Nixon did all of those things in order to get reelected, and he thought his reelection was in the national interest. And yet I strongly believe he should have been impeached. So I would believe that any president who committed crimes akin to that would be impeachable. Now, the Democrats didn't charge President Trump with any crimes. Had they charged him with bribery, that would be a very different matter. They'd then have to prove bribery, which would be hard to do, and the reason they didn't charge him with that is they didn't think they had the evidence for that. But that would make the issue very, very different.
Are you familiar with James Reston Jr., the author, the historian, written a bunch of books? He was also the chief advisor to David Frost when he did those famous Frost-Nixon interviews. I asked him about the comparison. I spoke to him recently. I asked him about the comparison with the Nixon impeachment. Have a little listen to what he had to say.
Absolutely, it meets the standard of impeachment, absolutely in every respect. I mean, the criminality and the allegations against Donald Trump far exceed what the charges against Richard Nixon was. And there is only one remedy in our Constitution for this kind of behavior, and that's what we're seeing unfold here.
James Reston says it far exceeds the allegations against Nixon. What do you think?
Well, if that was true, the Democrats should have impeached him for impeachable conduct. They didn't. They impeached him on grounds of abuse of power, which is not impeachable. I look at the actual articles of impeachment. It would be as if somebody were impeached for dishonesty or for maladministration or for anything else which was not in the Constitution. So you talk about technical reasons against impeachment. I would put it differently. Constitutional reasons against impeachment. James Reston Jr., who I admire and know from Martha's Vineyard, has the right to his opinion, but the Democrats didn't follow his advice. If they had impeached on impeachable grounds, then the debate would be different, the issue would be different, And I might not have agreed to play a role in this case. I agreed to play a role because the impeachment articles don't charge impeachable offenses. And that's the key, and that's the terrible precedent that would have been established.
Okay, and I admire your commitment to the law in and of itself, but I'm going to ask you for a second to take your lawyer hat off and put it away. I'm going to ask you as a citizen, as a professor, as a political thinker, as somebody who campaigned against Trump in 2016, as somebody who called him all those things that I mentioned. You called him corrupt, you said he will continue to be corrupt, you said he's destabilizing,
Right.
He'll violate international laws, and so on. With all of that in mind, as a president who survives impeachment in the Senate, congratulations, Alan Dershowitz, you handed him a second term. Are you happy to be included in that narrative? You defended him, he didn't get impeached, and he's going to get another term.
Well, if he gets another term, it will be completely the fault of the Democrats for impeaching him, just like it was the fault of the Republicans for impeaching Bill Clinton. They impeached Bill Clinton, and they increased his popularity, decreased their popularity. I defended Donald Trump, but they're the ones who impeached him, and by impeaching him, they have increased the likelihood of him getting a second term. So if he gets a second term, point the finger of responsibility directly where it belongs, at the Democrats who, for partisan reasons, shot themselves in the foot. Look, there's no certainty who will be elected. The American public will vote. That's the glory of America. We vote. Sometimes we mess it up like we did with the Iowa caucuses, but generally we have clean elections. I think the 2020 election will be clean because everybody in the world will be watching it, and the American public will decide. Among the issues they will consider is some of the negative things I said about Donald Trump. Some of the other things they will consider is the negative things about the Democrats. The Democrats lying, for example, about what I said. I never said that a president can do anything he wants, even anything illegal, in order to get elected if he thinks it's in the public interest. People will take that into consideration when they decide to vote Democrat or Republican. We're a long way off, 8.5, 9 months before the election, and a lot of minds will change. And if President Trump is reelected, it's because the American people wanted him to be reelected. You might also blame the Electoral College, which plays a disproportionate role in who gets elected president. But the idea that I defended him and made him president the second term, that's giving me a lot too much power that I don't have and don't wish to have.
Would you have made a different argument if the Democrats had controlled the Senate?
You always make different arguments depending on who your audience is. I think I would have made the same exact argument on principle, the argument that it was not constitutionally permissible. And I think I would have persuaded some Democrats. And remember that the framers required 2/3 of a vote. They wanted to have impeachments only on a nonpartisan basis or a bipartisan basis. They didn't want impeachments to go 51-49 the way the vote on witnesses went. They want, before a president's removed, they want bipartisan support for his removal of the kind we had during the Nixon administration. And we can go back to James Reston's question. Obviously, there was bipartisan. Nixon would have lost in the Senate almost unanimously, whereas the Senate vote here will be along party lines. That's a very, very different situation. So the senators, both Democrats and Republicans, have a very, very different view of this case than they do of the Nixon case.
Alan Dershowitz, come back to the program soon. Good to talk to you.